Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you might be. I am Nicole BC, and you know everything. This one's going to be fun. We are building on our emergent business series. I don't know if it's a series or not. It's just a current hyperfixation. It's not a current either. It's been something I've been thinking about for 30 years. No big deal. I thought I was alone in this, and then I realized they're actually much smarter, much more credible people that have been thinking and researching and implementing these particular strategies for decades. It's been neat. It's been neat diving into their research and feeling super validated. And in bringing this to actual organizations, both large and small, and I mean that mainly based on like employee size, not necessarily revenue or I don't know, like activity. That's the word I'm looking for. Wise. A few things are really starting to come to light. And these also aren't new. These have always been there. And as I grow in my own experience and hopefully credibility, I'm starting to kind of see behind the thing, right? Like the thing under the thing is one of my clients always likes to say. I talk a lot about how we're all wired differently, right? Like what works for me won't necessarily work for you. What works for you won't necessarily work forever. Like we're kind of in this constant state of evolution and adaptation, which is why regenerative business strategy makes a lot of sense. And also what one of my earliest episodes was about when I wouldn't say it was one of my first times in leadership, but it was a very challenging time for me in leadership. I'd stepped into the executive director role of an arts nonprofit in New Orleans. New Orleans is a pretty insular community in the sense that, like, if you know, you know. And I was an outsider, a carpetbagger, if you know, you know. And I was stepping into this organization that had been around for like 10 to 15 years and did things a certain way. People had certain expectations, and I was coming in and like shaking everything up because the organization was failing miserably. And I had some unique ideas. I had a very special team to work with. And I was leading from a place of example. If I can do it, you can do it too. And what I learned in that position was that's just not true. That's not an empowering statement. I thought that what I was doing was, reducing myself to any role within that organization and saying, well, I can do this. Therefore, that's proof you can do this. No, that's privilege, my friend. And where I've come from and what I've learned and how I work is unique. And some might consider it a gift, others a curse. But I talk a lot about, big people, little people, not from a place of judgment, better than worse. It's just more of a capacity to hold. Like, are you quite literally large and in charge? And then there are those that are just, I would say, more fixated, more specialized. Their purpose is focused. Again, this isn't coming from a place of judgment. I just want to make that clear. And so what that role in that organization taught me is that we are not the same. And that's good. That's an advantage. The things that you do and the way that you think and how you're wired and what lights you up could complement me. It could challenge me. It could be a non sequitur for me. All of those are great, right? If we were all the same, life would be pretty boring, very homogenized. So this episode is about when we start applying regenerative, adaptive, decentralized, autonomous, empowered, sovereign leadership and emergent strategy to organizations, recognizing everything that's been, honoring the structures and systems that got us here, living through the dismantling, picking up the pieces and trying to build something completely new, definitely not repeating what hasn't worked, perhaps extracting what did, but ideally drafting something no one's actually experienced and done before. There will be the drafters, there will be the builders, there will be the scaffolders, right? Like this design will take many roles to construct. And we are in the collapse. We talked a little bit how this process has collapsed, if you remember Zappos. they rolled out holacracy. And that suggested, so Zappos is I consider them to be a chip company. They probably do a lot more stuff, but they gave their team about 90 days to adopt this emergent business organization, and 30% of the team left. They introduced no bosses, self-managing circles, decentralized decision-making. Sounds like a dream. But the reality was it was a fucking mess. Nobody knew who was in charge of anything. Nobody knew how to get anything done. Nobody knew where the resources were. And they felt the opposite of empowered. They felt like they could not succeed. And so they left before they could take ownership in a company they perceived as being a failure. This model is supposed to be the future of work, yet chaos, at least as far as Zappos and holacracy are concerned, chaos consumed. Old hierarchies reemerged in the chaos. Confusion flared and decisions slowed to a crawl. Why? Because when you hand people emergent, decentralized, asynchronous, autonomous, sovereign, decentralized decision-making, but without scaffolding, without any kind of buy-in, without any belief, let alone structure, people don't take the leap. They freeze. Not because they're not big or they're not open, but because that's how they've been taught to perform, is to follow the leader and to do what they're told and look at process. We are not weak. We are habitual. We're not married to the system, but we're not inherently creative. If you've been listening to me at all, you've heard me say, I believe creativity is a skill. Let me rephrase. We are inherently creative, but it is a skill that we need to practice. To just throw people in the deep end, to push them off that ledge, to force them to leap, will create fear. We've been trained our entire lives to wait for instruction, to defer to authority, to avoid risk. Even when you say, it's your call. What do you think? That was when I learned the hard way, just asking someone, especially an employee who perceives you to be in a position of power, what they think. Firstly, if they've never been asked that question before, they need to learn how to do that. I know that sounds insulting. That's not what I mean. But truly at work, how many of us show up and unplug, right? We just go into automatic mode. For a lot of us, it's how we survive it, even when we're the boss. See you. And quite frankly, it's not been safe for most of us to think at work. It's not been safe for most of us to express our ideas, to be creative, to be unique and individualized. We were punished for that. So to just look around and go, it's your call. What do you think would work best? And also then ask them to be responsible for that? Most people will still look around for someone else to take the hit, for someone else to come up with the idea, for someone else to put their neck out, because they don't want to get cut. This was really interesting to me because, again, I'm pretty wired for the whole individualism, leadership, big person, take the fall, take the hit, keep on fighting, it's just kind of what I do. I really wish that wasn't the case. It would be a lot easier if I could just get in line. Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am's 3 bags full, ma'am. But instead I have to blow everything up and then fucking build it over and over again. It's neat. So yeah, next go around. I'd like the easy life, please. Anywho, not complaining. I'm incredibly privileged. Nothing to complain about. Just in it right now. So I've been in it for a minute. If you've been listening to this, Anywho, let's talk about some of the research behind this, because I actually did find this really interesting and very empowering and very helpful when you find yourself trying to collapse hierarchy, step away from leadership, but create a space that is safe enough for those that you work with to understand how to also lead in a manner that works best for them, what their boundaries are, what their communication styles are, what their feedback mechanisms are, like all of it. This research reminded me it's not as simple as saying, let's build new world business, right? It's not as simple as going, fuck the hierarchies, fuck the bosses, late stage capitalism can eat a dick. We still need some structure and systems in place to ensure that people feel like they can be successful in discovering how to be successful in these regenerative, decentralized organizations. Stanford research shows we are hardwired for hierarchy. Put people in a room and they instinctively look for a leader, even when no one's assigned. Status cues, think job titles, tone of voice, age, these trigger deference automatically. Here's the catch-22 of that. This was a real aha moment for me. When you take those things away, the people who identified with them experience suffering. So there is a hindrance to implementing these models because there are some that are attached to the power that comes with these cues. And if you've ever been fired from a job, if you've ever fucked up on a public platform, you know what I'm talking about, right? Like, it hits different than to just be told like, hey, we're removing your management. If you're management and you've just been removed, you might feel like you earned that, or you might feel like you paid your dues. I guess those are the same thing. But what I mean is, like, there were investments made. Those investments are varied. But oftentimes we as the investor want to see our investment matched in order to feel like this is a fair playing field. And when that is removed as a construct of the field we've been playing on, we can feel a little hard done by. Just something to be aware of when you start playing with these structures in your day-to-day. The cognitive burden. So in 2024, a SAGE study found that when people don't know the boundaries of their authority, they default to waiting. Ambiguity feels dangerous, so they seek cover. This was another fascinating one for me. So it's not just like, hey, you're empowered to make decisions now. Like when or what? Like, what decisions do I get to make when there's no limits? People like kind of stay put because they don't know where the edge is. It's an interesting paradox because you would think you just like run around and be free, but it's kind of like not knowing where the trap doors are. Like, you're not going to run around if somebody says, oh, and by the way, like every third step you might fall through the floor. Like, you're just going to be like, what is happening? That's kind of how removing power shows up in the subconscious. We don't know what to do, so we don't do anything because there's no longer anything pointing us towards what to do. And this is bigger than our own individual experience. Collectively, connectedly, our schools, our organizations, our ascension plans, which is what I refer to as these perceived pathways towards success, whatever that might mean for us individually, collectively, community, they reward compliance over initiative. We've been graded, we've been promoted, and we've been paid for following the rules. This is how you do it. These are the boxes that need to get checked off. These are the labels that you need to obtain in this order. That's just how we've been taught to think. And I personally continue to underestimate how much that influences every single thing I think, feel, and do consistently. And I've never followed any of that shit on purpose. And yet, I mean, from the moment I wake up in the morning, which I arguably do for one of those reasons, so that I can continue to play through one of those boxes, like it's a lot for someone who considers themselves to have been a consistent and total rebel for most of their experience. Now, so throw out the way we think about it, the way we've understood it and therefore behaved it, the way we've been taught it. Physically, like even our biology responds to this. Stress and uncertainty activate fear centers in the brain and narrows our ability to think, create, respond, react, hence the fawn freeze, fight, flight response. I call it level 1, 2 energy. It's an incredibly insular space where all we're trying to do is identify the finite, the singular point of pain or suffering or stimulation. Let's remove any judgment from it. The singular point of stimulation, our biological response is identified as stress, and remove it. So authority has shown up a lot like that. It has actually given us something to move against. Without it, where does our motivation come from? Where does our drive come from? Who are we without our fear or potentially our anger, our rebellion? It's a big one for the people that I work with. Once we, I don't want to say eliminate their fear or their anger, because that's not how it works. But once we understand it and we stop using it as motivation, there's a huge melting that unfolds, that occurs, that permeates, because we suddenly realize everything we've ever done has come from a place of fear or potential anger. And without it, there's not a lot of drive left. It's healthy, feels great, but we've got to find that chutzpah somewhere else. I can't just be our boss, right? So lastly, recent research coming out of Cambridge suggests that when people chase status, when people chase power, it creates envy and deviance instead of initiative. So this is kind of the flip side of what I was just talking about. If we're not using fear or anger to motivate ourselves, the other end of the spectrum thus far has looked like using power. Now that masquerades oftentimes as externalized indicators, cues like money, fashion, influence, titles, blah, 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 right? But at the end of the day, if we just think about it in terms of power, there is still this separation that occurs upon obtaining it. And a friend of mine likes to joke, there will always be a bigger boat. In seeking power, it's a bottomless pit. And it is something that there can never be enough of. And then we find ourselves seeking out those that exhibit even more, and then moving from a place of envy and deviance, separation, right? Of trying to both other and obtain what that example of our desire is. So anywho, the point of this being, it is a multi-pronged problem. And in order to build this new world that I keep talking about, in order to implement this regenerative, emergent, adaptive business strategy, all of this needs to be taken into consideration, including how to lead, how to lead ourselves. That was a very early podcast episode as well. A lot of people, at least in my early days when I started all of this particular style of work and the coaching, they didn't identify as leaders because our bosses had exhibited all of these problems, right? And we were anti-hierarchy. So then how could we be the founder CEO and be the boss? It felt really gross. And my reframe for that was, you got to lead yourself. And that's what we're asking everybody to do in this scenario in an emergent business, is lead themselves and participate in this culture, this organization, this organism, so that we are leading together. Decentralization isn't about removing leaders. It's about metabolizing power differently. So one of the earliest thought leaders in this, Mary Follett, asked, what if power isn't about force? What if we're not using power to make people do things? What if we are leveraging power together? Power stops being about control and it starts being about building capacity. That's what I mean when I talk about big people, just this capacity to hold. That's also an example of power. Companies that use purpose as a decision filter, this value alignment I've been beating over your head, they're not just posters on a wall, they're actual operating principles. And based on research out of MIT, they grow faster and more profitably than those that don't. Spotify tested this in real time. They called them the Spotify squads. And what they did was take these small teams that self-identified, that came together through purpose and shared values. And they were empowered to solve problems organizationally. Obviously, I'm making a very generalized submission here, but otherwise, it's a pretty involved case study. Anywho, the point being, what they discovered is autonomy worked because they paired freedom with rituals, these retrospectives, these decision-making processes, the do-done kind of example I gave in the last episode. They became these visible norms. And suddenly these little pockets of purpose-driven problem solving kind of became like these little culture clubs. And the performers within them came together for a specific reason. They solved specific problems. They had their own kind of like lingo and like, secret handshakes. And it became this visible, this recognizable, this value aligned little like power player within this larger organization. DAOs do this. DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, come together for a shared governance, a shared purpose through values, through agreed upon co-created decision-making methodologies. They automate that so that whatever the problems the organization is proposing to solve are brought to the organization in a unilateral way and then moved through their decision-making process so that everyone is involved. There's buy-in from the beginning, and the organization kind of has to stay committed to their purpose and values because it's built in to their productivity process. Decentralized organizations thrive when incentives align and communication is transparent. This isn't about utopia, it's about guardrails. That's what I want you to hear out of those different examples. We can remove leaders and we can empower decision-making, but there are parameters within which we play. It's just they're different than like, this is the process you have to follow over and over again. It's more about these are the ways we make our decisions and why. And from there, pretty much anything should be able to be thrown at you because you understand the why, you understand how we all make decisions. So the problem gets solved consistently, which is one of the biggest concerns my people bring to me when they ask, how can we turn our organization into decentralized? How can I trust my people to think like I think, to do what I would do? It's guardrails, my friend. It's like stay in your lane, even if your lane is like a 6-lane crazy ass California highway. It is a challenging evolution though. That trust leap, that trust fall that a leader takes when they go, okay, I'm going to empower my team. It does take a minute because you will watch them flounder. You will watch them fail. You will, it's like, I always say, sometimes people need to fall over before they look up and say, like, can you help me? And that's what I mean by show, don't tell. That's what I mean by lead by example. You don't berate them for falling over. You don't tell them everything that went wrong that led them to this moment. You start in this moment right now and you say, absolutely, that's why we're here, is to support each other. Stand up and let them try again. These obstacles because this isn't just delegation. This isn't just sharing tasks and responsibilities. This is truly allowing people to understand how this particular organism operates, how this organization succeeds. The consistency starts there when, the 90s and 2000s were all about like organizational culture. And there are some really interesting indicators in terms of if culture is consistent. But that's, one of the ways I've always defined leadership is that your organization would perform, maybe not at its best. It probably doesn't perform at its best when you're there, but your organization performs optimally with or without you being there. And that, I think, is what we're talking about in terms of decentralized, regenerative, adaptive organizations, is anyone could call in sick and no one would skip a beat because that organization can continue to operate. So some of the challenges that show up, not just in the trust fall and the implementation of this new way of being, are these shadow hierarchies. Old power will sneak back in, regardless of if you have an organizational chart or not. And I think that goes back to our wiring. There are people, I'm pointing at myself right now, if you're just watching, there are people who speak very confidently, who think very clearly, and who aren't afraid of fucking up. They show up like leaders because of the tone of voice, the speed in which they move, their fearlessness does not make them smarter, better, or more successful. I promise you that. But it's a behavioral trait, at least in the United States. Our society is recognized as successful, air quotes. And yeah, it's misleading. Just to keep an eye out for that. Ensure that, the INFJs, the introverts, the 9 and the 10s on your Enneagram, like everyone has a moment to contribute and co-create. And that's where I talk about feedback mechanisms. Some people are not going to speak up in a group. That doesn't mean that they're not a powerful contributor in your organization. It just means that they have a preferred communication style that might not emerge in all environments. Can you create an organism that allows for that connectivity despite the more obvious way of networking and communicating, right? Consensus addiction. I'm seeing this in a nonprofit that I am, shall we say, aligned with. There is so much safe space setting that there is no actual decision making. And people are going above and beyond to address the trauma and the privilege and the underdogs in the room, that by the time we actually get to what's the problem, what's the solution, like it's like we've just been to like a 2.5-hour group therapy appointment. Endless alignment meetings do paralyze decisions. This is kind of where the DAOs get it right. Like, automate that shit. This is where the do-done sort of decision making process supports. If you notice that you're spending more than, I would say, 40% of your time talking about what we're doing with our time, that's a challenge. And there's a bunch of different models out there to address this and help. What I will say, just for brevity's sake, is consensus is not co-creation. Push for something new to emerge, not to just keep doing the same thing over and over again, and definitely not to just get everybody to agree. That might mean you step away for a second. That will look like not making a decision. Play with it. The last thing that I see people defaulting to, regardless of how woke, sorry, insulting too soon, progressive, emergent, adaptive, decentralized, empowered they are, is seeking blame. Looking for some finite variable that we can then assess meaning to tell the story of how we got here right now. Doesn't matter. Without psychological safety, autonomy feels like a trap. If people don't feel safe to fuck up, then they will look for the why or the who in the fuck up. That is a waste of time and energy. There are infinite variables that got us here. It doesn't matter what story you tell. What matters is what matters is we are here and what are we going to do about it? Bring solutions to the table. Notice the data. It does tell a story. We're going up or we're going down. If we're going down, how are we course correcting? That's a very simple reframe, but it changes everything. We know how we got here. What I'm asking is not who's to blame, what management theorist, what corporations, what politicos. It's like, okay, cool. We got all that. Those are all assumptions we're also operating off of. What are we going to do differently? Can we test it? Let's prove that our difference leads us down a path we prefer, because it might implode. Look at Zappos again, right? The collapse is messy. No one's arguing with that. And it's necessary. What we talked about in the last episode is emergent starts at the edge of collapse. We don't seek out new when everything is hunky-dory. Does anyone say that anymore? I haven't said that in a minute. But truly, we don't look for solutions when we don't see problems. If you've worked with me, you'll know one of the most obnoxious things that I say is the opportunity is always in the problem. So let's talk about them as opportunities. That's one way we start creating this safe space where people do feel like they can fuck up, where people do feel like they can have an idea, they can speak up, they can mess up, they can be messy. That's creativity. You have to clear the old scaffolding before anything new can grow. We talked about the stats last week. CEOs are burnt out. Executives are having mental health crises. Everybody is taking a sick day because they can't. We know what happens when people disengage, when people give up, when people quiet quit. This is where removing leadership is going to be really interesting because even the leaders don't know anymore. That's some of the questions that were asked by these emergent business theorists. How can we lead when we don't know the answers? How can we build when we don't know what it looks like? We are all answering those questions right now. How? Something that's really interesting to document are your decisions. So I think we take for granted, I talked a lot about this at the beginning as well, like the big impactful decisions, we tend to and awe. We tend to and awe the big stuff. And then the little stuff we execute all day, every day. But it's the big stuff that'll actually change our lives. And it's the little stuff that doesn't fucking matter at all. So in this last week, we talked about doing a safe to fail experiment. Perhaps having run that through, or you should be about halfway through it now, notice the choices that are shot across your bow and how you respond to them. I'll often say this, an old client of mine is thinking about getting out of entrepreneurship and business ownership and getting back into an incredible employment opportunity. Talk about the umming and ahhing, right? And what I said, well, it's 5 p.m. on Friday for you. I don't think anyone's making this decision before 9 a.m. on Monday. I mean, the offer hadn't yet been extended. So give yourself the weekend to not think about this and notice how often it pops up. But most importantly, notice the story you're telling yourself. So I'm going to leave it there because otherwise I'll go on one of my fucking BZ digressions. The point being, log your key decisions, reasoning, and if possible, outcomes. It will be really interesting to go, well, on Tuesday, like in this particular example, Friday, I found out they wanted to do another interview with the entire executive team, who she knows the leader of. So chances of her getting the gig, pretty high, right? So I made the decision to delay thinking about this. Over the weekend, I thought about it 683 times, and I told myself that I would be ruining my family if I didn't take the job every single time. Monday morning, they decide to not extend me the job offer that is doable. Interesting, right? So that's what I mean in terms of how can we start really playing with what decentralized decision-making looks like? Look at how you make your own decisions. This will help you understand what decisions were actually impactful and what decisions ended up becoming nothing burgers. Like my friend could have just enjoyed her weekend. And then Monday morning was going to happen regardless, like nothing she could have done over the weekend. And it doesn't matter. All she wanted to do was actually not have to make the decision because it felt like such a big decision. And it turned out she didn't anyway. So just an example, I'm sure that's happened to you a million times where you stressed about something ad nauseum. And then it turns out there was no point in worrying about it, or vice versa. The thing you couldn't have even prepared for happened and you took care of it before you knew what was happening because you are the calm in the storm. Anywho, I told you, BZ digression, you're welcome. So back to that done decision-making process, right? What if you can give that to anybody? So suddenly anyone can decide. This shifts behavior from seeking permission to getting it done. What if they don't do it the way you would have done it, but it gets done? Have you ever let someone do that and then they do it better? How did that feel? So it's about how can we simplify this process to a 1-2 step? And then can we empower everybody around us that it might affect with that decision-making process? What happens next? Lastly, we talked a little bit about this at the beginning, this idea of guardrails. When we remove leadership, when we empower decision-making, that's not to say it is a free-for-all. When we create these visual maps, we talked a little bit about that, I think, in the last episode. But in terms of, what are the responsibilities here? What are the roles here? In the EOS, they talk a lot about that as well. Most of us are wearing multiple hats. So it's not about me, BZ, as the leader founder. It's about the role of marketing, the role of business development, the role of accounting, the role of client services, the role of client success, the role of administration. And if there are other resources in there, how are those particular roles and responsibilities being shared? And then if we introduce another layer to that, what does that look like in terms of platforms or technology or security? This reduces ambiguity. Therefore, it increases confidence. So when people understand the decisions that need to be made in each one of those potential roles and who may be affected by them, it gives them those guardrails. That just empowers people to make faster, better decisions. And let me also add, more consistent, so that decisions are being made in a very similar fashion across your organization. You can then trust that whomever is experiencing your organization is getting the experience that was intended, the purpose of the organization in the first place. Ways that you can sort of identify this evolution. I talk a lot about this as well. Like, words matter. My energy leadership index shows up in verbiage. Like, are we nervous? Are we excited? As an example, instead of who approved this, what principle guided this? Instead of who did that, we can ask what value alignment occurred. If we get a bad review, instead of saying what happened, we can say, what was the shared experience? This might feel like unclogging a river. The water was always there. Now it's just flowing. And I just went rafting the other day, but like, you can see the rocks. We got a lot of trees in our rivers right now. They're new. A lot of these rapids, guides had mapped them already, and they're all different now. Does that mean you're unsafe? No, but it does mean you need to look for different cues. You need to know what we're looking for. Do we have the skill set? Do we have the tools? Do we have the right boat? Do we, have people who are listening, who are participating, who get it? Can we go down this river safely together and have fun? I'm sorry, that's my value. You have everything you need. You don't need anything new. The new is happening to us. So how can you use your existing tools and resources in a way that supports this emergent discovery process? As an example, everybody's up in arms about AI, and I'm not going to get into that. But what I will say is AI allows for faster decision making. It supports decentralized decision making, especially when you're kind of building out these custom processes based on the way that you always worked. Assuming you're training your model well, you're going to find a lot of consistency there. And then that consistency can be offered to all sorts of different spaces and places in your organism and organization. What's happening externally, whether it's climate change or political change or economic change, they will punish rigidity. You will know you have an adaptive structure where people are empowered to respond versus react when your organization doesn't fear change, but recognizes change is evolution. And by adapting to what is happening, we are course correcting and guiding within those parameters that we've set for our sandbox and our playground. Burnout and complexity dissolve because people are empowered to take care of themselves, to identify and therefore resource their own needs, and they're respected in that, recognizing we're all different. The old system isn't broken, it actually broke us, and that's where the repair has already begun. So sure, the US has its own, challenges is a euphemism, right? We know that globally leaders are struggling. The mental health crisis is real. But what if the reframe, at least again here in the United States, is that scale fast pressure also makes the collapse quicker? Like we could be moving through this a hell of a lot faster than empires of yield in times. Decentralization isn't the end game, adaptivity is. But that's one of the ways we get there. Ask yourself, what decision am I postponing? Not because it's impossible, but because I'm afraid of how it will change me. That's it. That's your takeaway, my friend. Emergent business doesn't start in a chart. It starts in the moment. Stop waiting and start. Notice the emergence. Notice what is already happening. Focus on what's working. Okay? Believe me, this episode was for me just as much it was for you. And the what's working list is short, but it's there. This is working, right? I'm enjoying this. We'll focus on that in next week's episode. Thank you for being here. I love you. I would love to know your thoughts as per always. hello@NicoleBZ.com. Check me out on the Loop. That shows up a couple days from now. It's Friday mornings. That's it. That's all I got. See you soon.